Are you sure you're doing this right? Professor Warren's voice sliced through the tense silence, her words dripping with doubt. Peter froze, chalk in hand, his mind racing. Could he really do this? Could he prove everyone wrong? Show the world that age and skepticism were nothing but obstacles waiting to be shattered. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to back down. Hey, Story family, welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad you're here today. Thank you for tuning in to watch this incredible journey unfold. Kindly support my channel when you like, subscribe and comment where you are watching from. Today, you're in for an amazing story, so sit back, relax, and let's dive in. The lecture hall was filled with the hum of anticipation, the atmosphere charged with a quiet tension. Harvard University's Grand Lecture Hall had long been a space where the brightest minds gathered, but today the students could sense something unusual in the air. Peter Jackson, a 17-year-old freshman with a reputation that seemed to precede him despite his shyness, had always been the kind of student who preferred blending in, quietly excelling in his studies without drawing much attention. However, that was all about to change. At the front of the room, Associate Professor Elizabeth Warren stood with her arms crossed, her stern gaze scanning the class. Known for her exacting standards and reputation for being a formidable figure in the world of mathematics, she wasn't one to easily be impressed. It wasn't lost on the students that the professor seemed particularly eager today, her eyes flickering between Peter and the chalkboard as she prepared to test him. "You all know the rules," Professor Warren began, her voice crisp and authoritative, sending a ripple of expectation through the room. "Peter has been performing admirably in class so far, but let's see if his abilities hold up under pressure. Solve for the unknown angle in this right triangle using trigonometric functions." She wrote the problem on the board, a complex equation that would leave most students fumbling for answers. The class fell into a hush as the chalk squeaked against the blackboard, a sound that somehow made the task ahead feel all the more daunting. Peter stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. He had studied for this test, yes, but performing it in front of the entire class, especially with the skeptical glances that were being cast his way, was a different challenge altogether. The students whispered among themselves. Peter Jackson, the quiet, reserved kid who had only been at Harvard for a few months. Could he really solve something this advanced? Some of the more cynical ones exchanged looks, eyebrows raised, as if already prepared to see him falter. Professor Warren, meanwhile, stood tall with an air of challenge in her posture. "Let's see if you can handle this, Peter," she said, her voice smooth and filled with that all-too-familiar, almost dismissive tone. There was no doubt that she expected a perfect answer, but she also seemed to be waiting for something more. Maybe for Peter to rise to the occasion, or maybe, just maybe, for him to fail. Peter shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling every pair of eyes in the room on him. But as his gaze drifted to the chalkboard, the nervous flutter in his chest began to subside. This was his moment, the moment he had quietly waited for, without ever truly wanting it. He had always known that his gift in mathematics, his almost effortless understanding of trigonometry, would eventually draw attention. Today, that moment had come. Taking a deep breath, Peter walked to the front of the room, trying to ignore the weight of the students' stares. He reached for the chalk, his hand steady, and began writing down his approach. The board was filled with the equation, but to Peter, it was just another challenge waiting to be solved, one he had faced countless times before in his mind. The room was deathly quiet as he worked through the problem. He started with the sine function, explaining his steps aloud as he moved through the calculations, each motion smooth and deliberate. "We begin with sine, which is the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse." Peter's voice broke the silence. His words were measured, precise, each explanation coming naturally as though it were a second language to him. The students, who had been skeptical at first, were now watching in rapt attention, their whispers dying down as they followed his every move. His calmness was infectious. The tension in the room seemed to loosen ever so slightly as Peter continued. With each step, He explained how sine, cosine, and tangent could be used to find the unknown angle, showing how they related to the given sides of the triangle. His chalk danced across the board with effortless fluidity, drawing lines, angles, and equations that made sense to everyone who was paying attention. Professor Warren watched with a hint of surprise in her eyes. She had expected this to be a challenge for Peter, but instead she was witnessing something far more impressive: the natural grace with which he approached the problem, the quiet confidence that came from a deep understanding of his craft. As Peter moved through the calculations, even she found herself listening intently to his explanations. It was rare to see someone so young, so unassuming, yet so capable. The class, now completely silent, began to understand. This wasn't some lucky guess or a fluke. Peter wasn't just another student. He was a gifted mind, capable of achieving what many of them, even with years of experience, could only hope to understand. Peter didn't rush, taking his time to make sure each step was clear. As the final answer began to take shape, the last few lines of chalk felt like the conclusion of a symphony, each stroke bringing him closer to the solution. And then, when the problem was solved, Peter stepped back, his eyes meeting the class for the first time since he'd walked up to the board. A moment of quiet hung in the air, the silence of the lecture hall stretching out for what felt like an eternity. The challenge had been met. Peter's chalk paused mid-air, his hand hovering above the board as the last equation began to take form. His mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. With each precise stroke, he felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins, the thrill of solving something difficult, something that only a few moments ago seemed impossible. The solution was right there, so close he could almost feel the satisfaction of completion. He was in his element. The crowd of students had gone quiet, mesmerized by his calm expertise. He could almost hear their thoughts, slowly shifting from skepticism to admiration. This was his moment. But then, as if on cue, Professor Warren's demeanor shifted. It was subtle at first, a tightening of her lips, a narrowing of her eyes. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Peter felt the weight of her gaze on him, a piercing focus that seemed to scrutinize every move he made. "Hold on." Professor Warren's voice cut through the silence, sharp and demanding. "Are you sure you're doing this right?" Her words didn't carry the usual calm authority, but instead a sharp edge that caught Peter off guard. It was as though the entire room held its breath in unison. Peter's eyes flicked up to meet her gaze, his heart skipping a beat. He was momentarily thrown off balance, but quickly regained his composure. "Yes, Professor," he replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the unease that had begun to creep into his chest. "I'm following the steps properly." The professor didn't seem convinced. Her eyes narrowed further, her posture stiffening as she scanned the board once more, her sharp gaze darting from the equation back to Peter. The rest of the class was still, waiting. They could feel the change in the atmosphere, the tension suddenly thickening. Peter's confidence had been unwavering moments before, but now doubt crept in like an insidious shadow. What was happening? Professor Warren took a step forward, her voice now more forceful. "I think you're copying someone's work, Peter. You couldn't have solved this problem so quickly without help." She let the accusation hang in the air, each word landing like a blow. Peter's stomach churned. The word struck him with a force he wasn't prepared for. Cheating. The thought felt foreign, almost absurd. He had never cheated in his life. Every solution he had ever solved had been a product of his own understanding and hard work. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the accusation, but it was like a fog had descended over his thoughts. How could she think that of him? The class shifted uncomfortably. Some students glanced at each other, unsure of what was happening. Others avoided eye contact, the awkwardness palpable. Peter's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't believe it. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to prove himself, and now Professor Warren was questioning his integrity. The silence in the room seemed to stretch on, every pair of eyes on him. every breath held in anticipation. Professor Warren stepped closer, her voice now colder, more cutting. "You've seen this solution somewhere, haven't you?" She pressed, her words feeling like a challenge. "There's no way you could have figured this out in such a short time." Peter's breath hitched. The accusation stung more than anything he had ever experienced. He could feel the weight of the entire class's eyes on him, watching him carefully, waiting for him to crack. But he refused. He wouldn't give in. Peter opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had solved the problem the way he always did, methodically, with focus, and a deep understanding of the principles involved. But the pressure of the moment, the sudden shift in the room, left him feeling paralyzed. How could he explain something that seemed so simple to him, yet so impossible for everyone else to understand? The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Peter's hand tightened around the chalk, his fingers tingling with frustration. The equation on the board seemed to mock him now, its neat lines and perfect solution no longer a triumph, but a symbol of his growing discomfort. How could he make them believe him? How could he make her believe him? Professor Warren's gaze didn't waver. "You're hiding something," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "You didn't come up with this on your own. You're not that good." Peter stood frozen, the room feeling smaller with each passing moment. The whispers of the students around him became louder in his ears, a cacophony of judgment and doubt. His chest tightened, the heat of shame rising in his face, and his thoughts spun in a blur. How could he defend himself against an accusation like that? How could he prove his innocence when the very person who should have been encouraging him now seemed intent on tearing him down? The entire class was waiting. The room was suspended in time, as though all of Harvard's prestigious halls were watching his every move. Peter opened his mouth again, but the words wouldn't come. The shame, the confusion, the disbelief, it all choked him, leaving him silent. The hot rush of shame was overwhelming. How could his professor accuse him of cheating? The next day, Peter's world had crumbled in a way he never could have expected. The sting of Professor Warren's accusation still burned in his chest as he walked to the dean's office, his footsteps heavy. His mind raced, swirling with doubt and confusion. How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? He had been calm, confident, and methodical in solving that problem. He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, summoned to the dean's office like a criminal. Peter's fingers gripped the strap of his bag, his knuckles white as he approached the door. It seemed impossibly large, the brass handle gleaming under the overhead lights. He took a deep breath and knocked softly. A moment later, the voice of the dean called him in. The room was formal, lined with bookshelves filled with academic tomes, but today the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Professor Warren was already sitting in front of the dean's desk, her posture stiff, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but Peter noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. The usually confident, unflappable professor seemed different today. Perhaps it was the tightness in her jaw, or the way her eyes refused to meet his. "Peter," the dean greeted him with a solemn tone. His eyes were focused, and his gaze never wavered. "Professor Warren has expressed concerns about your recent exam performance. We need to clear this up." Peter's stomach turned, his throat tightening. He felt as if he had stepped into an alternate reality, one where everything he knew about himself, about his abilities, was being questioned. He had expected a moment of understanding, maybe even an apology, but instead he was met with this formal meeting with the dean and the professor who had publicly accused him of cheating. How had everything gotten so out of hand? "I didn't cheat," Peter said, his voice barely above a whisper, but he wasn't going to let the emotion swallow him. He had to speak. "I solved it on my own. I followed the steps. I used the methods I've been studying." The dean nodded slowly, his expression neutral as he listened. He then turned to Professor Warren, who hadn't said a word since Peter entered the room. The professor's eyes flickered toward the dean, a flicker of uncertainty betraying her usually commanding presence. I've looked into the situation, the dean said, breaking the silence, his tone measured. It seems there's more to this than just a quick solution. Professor Warren's frown deepened, her eyebrows knitting together as she leaned forward. What do you mean? She asked, her voice now tinged with frustration. The dean shifted in his chair and turned his gaze back to Peter, a knowing look in his eyes. Peter, he said, his voice soft yet reassuring, I've spoken with other professors, and I've reviewed your records. You didn't cheat. In fact, there's a simple explanation for all of this. Peter's heart skipped. He wanted to protest, to say he had never cheated, and that the truth had to be obvious. But there was something about the dean's calm demeanor that made him pause. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope. The dean turned to Professor Warren, who had been listening intently. The solution Peter used, he continued, it's not just advanced trigonometry. It's an algorithm that was recently discovered. It hasn't been fully published yet, and it's not something you would find in any of your textbooks. Professor Warren's brow furrowed in confusion. You're telling me Peter used a method that isn't in the textbook? How could he possibly know about it? The dean's eyes softened slightly as he turned back to Peter. Peter's understanding of trigonometry is so advanced that he intuitively arrived at this new method. It's not something he copied. He solved the problem using a new approach, one that others haven't even had the chance to recognize yet. Peter's mind raced. New method. The professor was still looking at him as if she couldn't comprehend the truth. He had solved it on his own, hadn't he? He hadn't copied anyone's work. It was his solution. But hearing the dean's words, it suddenly made sense. Peter had always been ahead of his peers when it came to math. His brain had a way of grasping concepts faster than others, and perhaps he had stumbled upon something that no one else had recognized yet. The professor shifted in her seat, clearly taken aback. Her lips parted as though to speak, but then closed again. The weight of the realization seemed to hit her slowly, as though it were a wave, washing over her all at once. You're saying, her voice faltered, her usual certainty now replaced by uncertainty. Peter actually solved this the new way. The dean nodded, his expression gentle but firm. Yes, Peter's understanding of trigonometry led him to use this new method. He wasn't cheating. He was simply ahead of the curve. Professor Warren sat back, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze drifting to the floor as she processed the revelation. For the first time, Peter could see a glimmer of humility in her eyes. The unshakable professor, the one who had always prided herself on knowing everything, seemed genuinely stunned. Peter, the dean added, his voice warm with the assurance that only came with truth, you weren't wrong. You didn't cheat. You were just ahead of all of us. For a brief moment, Peter felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud was beginning to dissipate. Yet, as Professor Warren's gaze met his, there was no denying the complexity of emotions flickering between them. The next day, the lecture hall was just as grand as it had been the day before, but today, a different kind of energy filled the room. Peter sat in the back, his body tense, and his mind still processing everything that had transpired in the past 24 hours. The sting of Professor Warren's accusation still lingered, though it had softened somewhat in light of the dean's words. But there was a new sense of pride that had replaced the shame he had once felt. He had been right all along. His instincts and understanding of trigonometry had guided him. And now, at least, the truth had come to light. Peter sat quietly, his eyes cast downward as he tried to avoid the eyes of his classmates, most of whom were still unsure of what to make of the situation. Some of them had nodded at him with hesitant smiles the day before, acknowledging that he had been unfairly accused. Others had simply kept their distance, unsure of how to approach him after the public confrontation. Professor Warren stood at the front of the room, her posture straighter than usual, her hands clasped in front of her as she cleared her throat. The room fell silent as the professor's gaze swept across the students, then came to rest on Peter. It was clear that this moment held weight that neither she nor Peter could avoid. The professor had always commanded authority in this room, but today it was different. Today there was an apology to be made. "I'd like to apologize to Peter Jackson," Professor Warren began, her voice carrying through the room with an unusual calm. There was no edge to her words, no sharpness. This wasn't the same professor who had so forcefully accused him the day before. "Yesterday, I wrongfully accused him of cheating, and after speaking with the dean and reviewing the situation, I realize now that he has simply demonstrated an exceptional understanding of trigonometry. He was ahead of us all." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Peter felt them settle on him like a blanket. The apology was direct, honest, and unlike anything he had expected. In that moment, he felt the weight of the past few days lifting from his shoulders. But there was something else, a newfound sense of respect, not just from the professor, but also from himself. The silence in the room stretched out, as if the entire class were holding their breath. Peter remained still, his heart racing as he processed the situation. The tension, the doubt, the accusations, they had all been wiped away in an instant, but the gravity of it all still lingered. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, their judgment now replaced with curiosity and, for some, admiration. And yet, the most important thing was that his abilities, his intelligence, had been finally recognized. Then, as if on cue, the first clap rang out from the back of the room. It was soft at first, unsure, but as the sound of it echoed through the hall, others joined in. Slowly at first, but with increasing enthusiasm, the applause built. Peter's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. In fact, he had spent most of his life avoiding it. But this was different. This wasn't praise for something superficial. It was recognition for what he had done, for what he had achieved. The applause felt strange at first, almost too much, but then it became something else, something genuine. Peter felt the warmth of it spread through him. It wasn't just relief anymore. It was respect. And not just from his classmates, but from himself. For the first time, he could see that his abilities weren't something to be ashamed of, something to hide. They were a gift, one that could help him go further, if he was brave enough to embrace it. Peter looked up at Professor Warren, who stood at the front of the room. Her expression softened. She wasn't the same woman who had accused him the day before. The apology was sincere, and Peter could see the weight of it in her eyes. She had been wrong, but she had owned it. That, more than anything, helped him let go of the bitterness that had gnawed at him. This wasn't just an apology for the accusation. It was a recognition of his worth, of his potential. As the applause began to die down, Peter stood slowly, his heart still racing. He felt a wave of emotion rise in him, but he kept it in check. He wasn't the type to let his feelings spill out. Instead, he gave a quiet nod to the class, acknowledging their support, and turned his gaze to the professor. "Thank you," Peter said quietly, his voice steady. The words felt simple, but they carried more weight than he had ever thought possible. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the acknowledgement, the recognition of his abilities, and the respect that had been so hard to come by. Professor Warren nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, something that hadn't been there the day before. She had seen his potential, and perhaps for the first time, she had truly understood it. The room settled into a quiet hum as the class resumed, but Peter's mind was elsewhere. He felt a shift inside himself, one that went deeper than the apology, deeper than the applause. It was a recognition that had to come from within. He was no longer the quiet student hiding in the back of the room. He was Peter Jackson, a force to be reckoned with, and for the first time, he truly believed it. Later that night, Peter sat on the edge of his bed, his back against the cool wall of his dorm room. The soft hum of the campus outside barely reached his ears, and the low light from the desk lamp cast a quiet glow over the room. His laptop sat closed on the desk, books scattered around him in a half-organized mess. His gaze was fixed on the window, where the dark sky stretched out endlessly, speckled with stars. The past few days had been a blur, A whirlwind of accusations, tension, apologies, and validation. The entire experience had unfolded with such speed that Peter hadn't had much time to process it all. At first, the sting of Professor Warren's accusations had consumed him. The fear and doubt that followed had been suffocating, threatening to swallow him whole. But now, as he sat in the stillness of his dorm room, those emotions began to fade. He hadn't just solved a trigonometry problem. He had done something far more significant, something that went beyond mathematics. Peter leaned back slightly, his thoughts drifting back to the lecture hall, to the moment when Professor Warren had apologized. He had been on the receiving end of her suspicion, her disbelief. He could still remember how the class had fallen into a tense silence, watching as the professor's words had turned from accusation to acknowledgement. He could hear the applause, feel the weight of it, even now. But it wasn't the applause that stayed with him. It was the respect, the kind that couldn't be bought or faked. It had come from proving his worth not only to the class, but also to himself. He hadn't been the quiet, unnoticed student any longer. That day, Peter had stepped forward, confidently showing that even though he was young, even though others may have underestimated him, he could stand his ground. He could rise to any challenge, no matter how daunting, and he could do it with integrity and skill. A small smile tugged at Peter's lips as he reflected on it. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to shrink away from the spotlight. He hadn't just earned the respect of Professor Warren, whose reputation for intelligence and authority had once intimidated him. He had earned the respect of his classmates too. More importantly, he had earned respect from himself. And that, he realized, was what had been missing all along. Before that moment in the lecture hall, Peter had always felt like an outsider, not just because of his age or his quiet nature, but because he had never fully embraced his own abilities. He had always been content to sit at the back, blending into the background, letting others shine. He had been good at math, sure, but he never wanted to stand out. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. But now, sitting in the quiet of his room, he saw things differently. Peter had faced a challenge, one that made him uncomfortable, one that brought him to the brink of doubt. And he had come through it stronger. He had shown everyone, but more importantly, he had shown himself that he was capable of more than he had ever realized. The respect that had followed the apology wasn't just because he had solved the problem. It was because he had faced a challenge head-on, without hesitation, and come out victorious. As he looked out at the night sky, the stars blinking down from above, Peter felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the type of peace that came from avoiding confrontation, from hiding in the background. It was the peace that came from knowing he had proven himself, both to others and to himself. Peter had always thought of himself as just another student at Harvard, trying to fit in, trying to find his place. But now he understood that he had earned his place, not by staying silent and staying in the background, but by standing strong, by confronting his fears, and by letting his abilities speak for themselves. He wasn't just a student at Harvard anymore. He was someone who had earned the right to be there. Someone who had proven that age, doubt, and fear didn't define his worth. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought, where you are watching from, and stay tuned for more incredible stories just like this one. Thank you for being part of the story family.